The room went quiet for just a second when he stepped inside. Not the respectful kind of quiet. The kind that comes before judgment. Eyes lifted slowly, scanning him from head to toe. Some lingered too long. Others didn't bother to hide their disappointment. A few exchanged looks, subtle smiles forming as if they had already agreed on who he was without hearing a single word from him. He felt it immediately. That heavy, familiar weight pressing against his chest. The whispers didn't start right away. They never did. First came the stares. Then the half-smiles. Then the quiet chuckles that sounded harmless if you weren't the one standing alone in the middle of the room. He adjusted his jacket not because it was out of place, but because it was a habit. A way to ground himself when he walked into spaces that weren't built for him. Spaces where his skin spoke louder than his resume. Where assumptions were made faster than introductions. Someone near the back leaned toward another and murmured something. Laughter followed. Low. Controlled. Cruel. He didn't turn around. He had learned a long time ago that reacting too quickly only gave them what they wanted. Instead, he walked forward calmly, his shoes echoing softly against the polished floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from fear but from awareness. He knew exactly what they were thinking. He doesn't belong here. How did he even get in? He must be lost. A man near the front raised an eyebrow and smirked. Another crossed his arms, clearly unimpressed. One woman glanced at her phone, as if his presence alone had already wasted her time. No one said hello. No one offered a seat. It wasn't loud disrespect. It was worse. It was deliberate exclusion. He stopped near the center of the room, hands relaxed at his sides, posture straight. His face remained calm, unreadable. Years of experience had taught him how to master that expression, the one that gave them nothing to use against him. Inside, though, his mind was racing. Not with anger. Not with fear. With memory. He remembered being younger, standing in a similar room, feeling smaller than everyone else. Back then, he would have lowered his head. Back then, he would have tried to make himself invisible. But that version of him didn't survive the world. This one did. A voice finally broke the silence. So, are you sure you're in the right place? The tone was casual, but the message was sharp. A few people smiled, enjoying the moment. They were waiting. Waiting for him to stumble. Waiting for him to snap. Waiting for confirmation that their assumptions were correct. He looked toward the speaker slowly. Not offended. Not defensive. Just calm. Yes, he replied quietly. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. That only made it worse. A couple of them laughed openly now. Someone shook their head as if amused by his confidence. Another whispered, unbelievable. He noticed everything. The way no one stood up. The way no one asked his name. The way respect was withheld like a privilege he hadn't earned, at least, not in their eyes. But what they didn't know was this. He had earned it many times over. Just not in ways they recognized yet. He moved to the empty chair at the far end of the table and sat down without asking permission. The chair scraped slightly against the floor, the sound cutting through the room like a quiet challenge. That got their attention. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked annoyed. The man who had spoken earlier leaned back, folding his arms tighter now, his smirk fading just a little. They had expected embarrassment. They had expected hesitation. They hadn't expected composure. Still, the disrespect lingered in the air, thick, intentional, waiting to see how far it could go. And deep down, every single person in that room believed the same thing. That this man would either break or prove them right. They didn't know yet that part one was only the beginning. And that his response wouldn't come in words. But in timing. The meeting began without acknowledging him. Names were called. Titles announced. Achievements praised. Each introduction was followed by nods, smiles, and polite applause. When it came time for his turn, the moderator's eyes skipped right over him as if he were an empty chair. No correction. No pause. No apology. Just omission. A few people noticed and exchanged looks. Not uncomfortable ones, amused ones. This wasn't an accident. It was a message. You don't matter here. He sat still, hands folded, breathing steady. His face gave nothing away, but inside, he felt the familiar tightening. Not pain pressure. The kind that comes when you know a line is being crossed on purpose. The man who had questioned him earlier leaned forward slightly. So, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, before we continue, maybe we should clarify something. The room stilled again. Who invited you? There it was. Sharp. Public. Designed to corner him. A few people looked down at their notes, pretending neutrality. Others watched closely, eager for the moment to turn uncomfortable. This was the part they enjoyed: the exposure, the subtle power of watching someone squirm. He met the man's gaze calmly. I was invited, he said. By who? The man pressed, smiling thinly. A woman nearby let out a quiet laugh, quickly covering it with a cough. Someone else shook their head as if this was already taking too long. He could feel the eyes on him now, curious, judgmental, impatient. Waiting for proof. Waiting for him to fail the test they had invented. He named the person. There was a pause. Then laughter. Not loud, but dismissive. The kind that says nice try. The man leaned back again, clearly satisfied. That's interesting, he said. Because that person isn't even part of this department. A few nods followed. Murmurs spread like a low hum. Someone whispered, I knew it. The moderator cleared his throat but didn't step in. Silence, once again, was being used as a weapon. He felt the heat rise not to his face, but behind his eyes. A memory flashed briefly, another room, another moment, another time when he had spoken too much and paid for it. He swallowed the instinct to defend himself. Not yet. Instead, he said, I understand the confusion. That made them pause. I'll wait, he continued evenly, until the right moment. The man frowned. Wait for what? For clarity, he replied. That answer irritated them. Disrespect feeds on reaction, on anger, on embarrassment, on explanations given too quickly. His restraint starved it. And that only made them push harder. Well, the man said, tapping his pen against the table, until then, maybe you should just observe. This discussion is quite advanced. A few people smiled. One person outright chuckled. He nodded once. Of course. But inside, something shifted. Not rage. Resolve. He leaned back slightly, eyes lowering, not in submission, but in patience. He listened carefully as the conversation moved on. Numbers were thrown around. Strategies discussed. Plans praised. And with every passing minute, he noticed something else. Mistakes. Small ones at first. A flawed assumption. A missed variable. An idea everyone agreed with simply because it came from the loudest voice in the room. He said nothing. They mistook his silence for ignorance. The man across from him grew more confident, more careless. He interrupted others. Dismissed concerns. Took control of the room like it belonged to him. This is how it's done, he declared at one point. Trust me. Several heads nodded automatically. He almost smiled. Because he knew something they didn't. He knew exactly where this plan would fail. He had seen it before. In fact, he had been brought into rooms like this one to fix the aftermath quietly, efficiently, without credit. He had learned long ago that ego was the loudest liability in any room. Still, the humiliation wasn't done with him. As the meeting neared its end, the moderator glanced in his direction for the first time since it began. "We're wrapping up," he said. "Any final thoughts?" A pause. Then, as if remembering him last, he added, "From anyone who hasn't already spoken." The emphasis was clear. This was their final test. Say something wrong, and confirm their bias. Say nothing, and remain invisible. He lifted his head slowly. The room watched. Not because they respected him, but because they were ready to dismiss him one last time. He opened his mouth and chose his words carefully. "Before you finalize this," he said calmly, "there's something you may want to reconsider." The man across the table scoffed. "And that would be?" He met his eyes. "The assumption that this plan will succeed." The air changed. Just slightly. Enough to make a few people sit up straighter. Enough to make the smiles fade. Enough to signal that whatever they thought this man was, they might have been wrong. But they still had no idea how wrong. Part 2 ended with doubt. Part 3 would bring consequence. The room didn't erupt. It froze. The kind of silence that follows a statement no one expected to hear from someone they had already dismissed. A few people blinked. Others shifted in their seats, suddenly aware that something had changed but not yet sure what. The man across the table laughed once. "Short. Forced. That's a bold claim," he said. "Care to explain?" The tone was still mocking, but thinner now. Less certain. All eyes turned back to him. This was the moment they had unknowingly created. The one they believed would expose him. The one they thought would put him back in his place. He didn't rush. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table not to dominate the space, but to claim it. His voice remained calm, measured, almost conversational. "The projected growth assumes stability in supply," he began. "But your supplier renegotiated their contract 6 months ago. The clause you're relying on no longer applies." Someone frowned. Another glanced at their notes. "That's not accurate," the man said quickly. "We reviewed those terms." "You reviewed the old version," he replied. "The revised one limits volume after the 3rd quarter." A pause. A woman near the middle pulled her laptop closer, fingers moving fast. Her expression changed. Subtle but noticeable. He continued. "You're also overestimating demand in the 2nd phase. The market hasn't recovered there yet. The data you're using is 2 years old." The moderator shifted in his chair. "That data was verified," someone said, defensive now. "By an internal report," he answered. "Not by field analysis." More typing. More uneasy glances. The man who had led the mockery straightened, his confidence beginning to crack. "Even if that were true," he said, "it wouldn't derail the entire plan." He nodded once. "On its own, no. Combined with the regulatory delay you haven't accounted for, it will." "That did it?" "Regulatory delay?" the moderator asked sharply. He turned toward him. "The permit you're expecting in Q2 won't be approved on time. The guidelines changed last month." The room came alive now, not with laughter, but with urgency. Chairs shifted. Papers rustled. Screens glowed brighter. "That hasn't been announced," someone said. "It has," he replied. "Just not publicly." The man across from him stared now, jaw tight. "And how would you know that?" He met his gaze calmly. "Because I've worked on 3 projects affected by the same change." No arrogance. No smugness. Just fact. The woman with the laptop looked up. "He's right," she said slowly. "The update is there. It's buried, but it's there." Silence fell again. Different this time. He could feel the shift not just in attention, but in respect. Not earned through force or volume, but through precision. Through knowledge. Through restraint. The moderator cleared his throat. Why wasn't this raised earlier? He didn't answer right away. Because everyone in that room already knew. They hadn't asked him. They hadn't listened. They hadn't believed he was worth hearing. I was waiting, he said finally, to see if the plan could withstand scrutiny. The man across from him scoffed again, but it sounded weaker now. And your conclusion? That it can't, he said evenly. Not as it stands. The moderator leaned back, rubbing his temple. Then what would you suggest? That question, simple, respectful, landed heavier than any insult that had come before. He didn't rush to enjoy it. He outlined adjustments. Clean. Logical. Efficient. He spoke without ego, without showmanship. Every point connected to the next, dismantling the flawed structure and rebuilding it piece by piece. Heads nodded, not out of habit now, but understanding. The man who had mocked him said nothing. When he finished, the room was quiet again. But the energy had completely changed. The moderator exhaled slowly. That would have saved us millions. He nodded. It still can. Eyes turned toward him, not with judgment this time, but curiosity. The moderator asked softly, "Can you stay after the meeting?" The man who had questioned his presence looked down at the table, jaw clenched. Because in that moment, everyone realized the same thing. They hadn't just underestimated him. They had nearly ignored the most valuable voice in the room. Part 3 ended with realization. Part 4 would bring revelation. The room had changed. Not completely. Disrespect doesn't vanish overnight, but the weight of assumption had shifted. People no longer saw him as someone to dismiss. They saw him as someone who had quietly demonstrated what they couldn't: knowledge, composure, and foresight. After the meeting, the moderator approached him. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. We didn't take you seriously before. That was wrong." He nodded. No anger. No triumph. "I understand," he replied. "It happens more often than you think." Word spread fast after that. Colleagues who had ignored him, whispered behind him, or tried to humiliate him, now approached him with questions, requests for advice, even respect. Some were hesitant. Some were still skeptical. But they couldn't deny the facts: he was right. Every point he had raised had been validated. Every adjustment he suggested was being implemented. The man who had publicly mocked him earlier approached last, hesitant. "I didn't expect you to know all that," he admitted. "I thought this was going to be easy." He smiled slightly, not with arrogance, but with quiet assurance. "Neither did I," he said. "But I never underestimate the work or the people behind it." The revelation wasn't just for them, it was for everyone in the room. They realized that respect isn't given. It isn't assumed. It is earned. And sometimes, it is earned quietly, while others are too busy laughing to notice. Later, outside the building, someone asked him how he remained so calm during the humiliation. He paused, considering the question. "It's simple," he said finally. "When people try to put you down, they're testing a reaction. If you give them anger, you give them control. If you give them nothing, eventually, the truth speaks louder than any insult." He walked away that day without celebrating or boasting. But the impact of his presence lingered in the room long after he had left. The people who had mocked him now had a choice: continue judging, or learn from someone they had underestimated. And in that quiet revelation, he had already won. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand recognition. He simply acted. The weeks after the meeting were quiet, almost unremarkable to those who hadn't seen the room change that day. But behind the scenes, he began implementing the strategies he had suggested. Adjustments were made. Plans were corrected. Flaws were fixed. And slowly, the project that had seemed on the verge of failure began to flourish. The people who had mocked him, they watched in disbelief as the numbers improved, as clients praised the results, as deadlines were met without crisis. The very same people who had whispered, laughed, and doubted, now depended on his insight. But the best part wasn't the success, it was the way he carried it. He didn't rub it in. He didn't point out past mistakes. Instead, he mentored quietly. He guided subtly. He allowed the results to speak for themselves. And the room, once full of judgment and scorn, now carried a different energy, respect, acknowledgement, and in some cases, genuine admiration. The man who had led the humiliation approached him one morning. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice was stiff, but sincere. He shook his head. "No need," he said. "You learned something important. That's enough." Others followed. Each apology was a recognition, not of weakness, but of his strength, his composure, patience, and ability to rise above disrespect. He realized then that the response they had never expected wasn't a confrontation, a comeback, or revenge. It was far simpler, far stronger. He had turned their disrespect into his advantage, and in doing so, he had elevated not just himself, but the very space they had tried to diminish him in. Walking down the hall later that day, he caught snippets of conversation. People spoke differently now, not about who he was, but about what he could do. And while some old judgments lingered, most had shifted. He smiled quietly to himself. Because the truth was this: respect cannot be demanded. It cannot be faked. It is earned, quietly, persistently, without shouting, without theatrics, without anger. And when it comes, it is more powerful than any insult. That day, they learned it. And more importantly, he didn't have to say it. He had shown them. The response they never expected was never about them, it was about him.